So now I'll introduce Dr. Maya Papineau from Carleton University. And I think she's going to talk to us a little bit more about policy approaches.
Yes. I think that should be all right. Okay, so I'm going to talk about economic and policy considerations for increasing resilience to climate change in Canada. But before I get into the main material, I just want to step back a little bit and note that I'm an economist. A lot of people tend to not like economists, but I'm the good kind of economist because I'm an environmental economist. And I'll just say that environmental economists focus most of their work on markets that exhibit what we call market failure. And when a market failure occurs, the outcome generated by the market is not optimal for society. And environmental economists then step in and work on looking at case studies and policy scenarios and responses to try to improve on the outcomes generated by markets. And climate change is a quintessential market failure. It arises from the failure of markets to reflect the social costs of carbon dioxide. And so kind of given that this background information, I'd like to kind of now step in and speaking of the policy response, given that there's a market failure here, the policy response side of things comes into the picture. And so this is where I think speaking about what types of policy responses we kind of want to start approaching brings us to the prospect of political action. Okay? And so we will need to take political action in Canada to address climate change. And a good segue to get to the question of whether we can achieve political action, I think, is to kind of remind people in this room that overwhelmingly Canadians exhibit a strong willingness to take action on climate change. This is maybe something that gets lost in some of the media coverage and maybe some of the polarization that many of us maybe have observed in the conversation about climate change. But let me start by noting a few things. So this is an Angus Reid poll that was published late last year, so I believe end of November. And really the takeaway that I want to point out here is just this first set of results here. There's a breakdown after, but the first results I think are the most important ones. What does this tell us? This tells us that 75% of Canadians believe that climate change is either a very serious threat to the planet or a serious threat, okay? And 87% of Canadians, so random sample of Canadians, right? This is a random sample, agree that the global temperature is rising, okay? And even amongst, perhaps, one might think amongst conservatives, that might not be so much agreement on that. Overwhelmingly, conservatives believe that global temperatures are rising as well. So if you kind of take this at face value, I think this implies that many Canadians believe the temperature is rising. And when it comes to adaptation investments, many of these investments to improve our resilience to climate change will be to mitigate the negative consequences of these temperature rises. And so finally, the last poll I want to point out here is that 61%, so over 50% of Canadians, believe that they can personally contribute to reducing global warming. Okay. So then comes the question of what is the best way to go about addressing the market failure of global warming? And really the best way to do this is to have a globally coordinated carbon tax or equivalent system such as a cap and trade system that increases over time. Now, this has been difficult to enact politically, not only at the global level, but even at the national level. And so absent a robust response to mitigate climate change, we have to accept that today and going forward, we're going to be facing some serious consequences of climate change. We're already facing them. There's news articles that are coming out, almost every day. You can notice a news article related to extreme weather events. So this brings me into kind of trying to quantify how do we get our head around what are the negative consequences that we're already facing, right? And really, we are already facing this, and these consequences will just get worse over time. So what I'm showing you here is some data on insurance statistics. And I think insurance data is based on insurance responses to climate disasters. particularly when it comes to stormwater, water damage, basically. And so here what you're seeing is the number of natural disasters requiring compensation in Canada from 1970 to 2015 has a significant upward trend, okay? And these events incur significant costs. And so the next figure here is, again, from data from the insurance industry. Catastrophic insured losses in Canada from extreme weather events between 1980 to 2017. Again, you see, an increasing trend. Some of the kind of more memorable events that got a lot of media coverage are covered here. But really, I think some of these statistics that I've included here really drive home the point of, even today, we're facing some serious consequences from climate change, right? So insurance payouts have been doubling every 5 to 10 years since the 1980s, okay? And if you're looking at the average amount of insured losses on an annual basis, between 1983 and 2008, you're looking at an average of about just over 400 million. Between 2009 and 2017, that annual average is $1.8 billion per year, okay? So these things are happening already. These are serious consequences of climate change. And these are likely, these insurance market impacts are likely to have knock-on effects on many other parts of the economy. I only have 10 minutes, so I can't mention all of them, but I read a report from one set of experts that noted the likelihood that mortgage default rates are likely to start to increase in Canada significantly because of the fact that insurance premiums are going to continue to keep rising, and some homes will become simply uninsurable. So some people will just no longer have access to insurance and will face the costs. They will have to pay the costs themselves from the consequences of storm damage, for example. So that leads to mortgage default rates. Another thing I'll note before moving on to the next slide is there have also been many reports that have found that when you survey, firms, companies, industries, including the insurance industry, and you ask them whether they're planning for the future consequences of climate change, the news is not good. Many firms, many industries are not planning ahead. And that just means that when the negative consequences hit in the future, the unplanned nature of these consequences will increase the costs even further, right? Because when unexpected things happen, you're not prepared and the costs will just be even higher. And this brings me to this quote that I came across late last year from the former governor of the Bank of Canada and current governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney. He recently warned of, quote, the catastrophic impact climate change could have on the global financial system. And this statement of his primarily came from the fact that firms are just not incorporating climate change scenarios into their planning, into their decision making. Okay, so now with respect to community resilience, what type of a policy response needs to happen? Again, so I have 10 minutes. One can say many things about this, but I think one policy response that I'd like to bring up in my talk is the importance to significantly increase our investments in natural assets and natural infrastructure. What do I mean by that? What are examples of that? Some examples are here. So here you've got the Chicago City Hall, a green roof. So green roofs are one way to invest in mitigating heat island impacts, so the heat island effect that exacerbates temperature increases in cities. But green roofs also have benefits in terms of absorbing stormwater and mitigating the impacts of large storms. Sustainable urban drainage systems, similar type of not on roofs, but similar types of investments in greenery at the ground level in urban and even non-urban settings to reduce the impacts of storms. And to actually kind of look at the values of wetlands and forests in terms of their benefits in managing the consequences of increasing rate of storms. And so I've come across a few studies that have tried to quantify the benefits of green infrastructure in mitigating the negative consequences of climate change. But one thing to keep in mind is that as climate change becomes worse over time, the value of these green infrastructure investments will just increase. Now, so this is something that I think our societies absolutely have to figure out how to kind of increase our investments in. And that statement is bolstered by the fact that even though there are some studies, some case studies and pilot projects that have found the benefits and tried to quantify the benefits of natural infrastructure investments, there are significant knowledge gaps that exist, and at the moment, significant investment gaps. And so I've put a link to 2 reports that some of this information comes from on green infrastructure investments. But basically the point is there are substantial gaps that actually hinder our ability to successfully implement green infrastructure investments to mitigate and to increase community resilience. And we need to invest in more projects. In other words, we need to invest in R&D and pilot projects to gather data, to monitor outcomes, and to gather evidence on what works and what doesn't. Because these investments tend to be very place-based. They will vary depending on what municipality you're talking about. And another important thing is that there needs to be greater investments in people as well. Another thing that has been identified from several reports are technical and institutional capacity gaps at local governments. So this means that we need to invest in the people that have expertise to actually implement on the ground these green infrastructure investments and actually roll out these R&D and pilot projects. And the other thing I'll point out, the missing data also has a negative consequence purely on the economic side, in the sense that if you want to make a business case and convince the population at large of the benefits of green infrastructure investments, you need data. And so you can't manage what you can't measure. So the lack of data is also hindering our ability to make a business case for resilience investments. And I kind of feel like when I was writing this up, I sounded kind of like a downer, saying there's all this missing data. But these are all, I think that we should all think about this as opportunities, right? These are opportunities to kind of step up our investments. These are places where we have identified where we can put our dollars to kind of mitigate this market failure. Okay. Now, a couple other points I want to make before I let it go to the questions. I think that the work of economics Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom. She's the only woman who's won the Nobel Prize in economics, and actually I think that her work on adaptive governance is really very relevant in terms of suggesting the best ways our institutions can deliver on these investments and deliver on increasing community resilience. And I'll just kind of note 3 characteristics of adaptive governance that Ostrom and her colleagues have identified for successful climate change governance. One of them is to have broad-based dialogue. And this broad-based dialogue really should include experts, but also include resource users. Use informed analysis, right? So going back to the importance of gathering data, but also focus on making time for deliberation, making time for building consensus, and making time for building trust amongst the different groups that are going to be needed in deploying these investments. And nesting is another important one. So Ostrom's work talks about the importance of having complex and multi-leveled institutions to deliver this, right? So we don't only want to focus on a very hierarchical, top-down, central governance type of a model. And finally, institutional variety is going to be absolutely important as well. And this means that we're going to need markets to solve this problem. Yes, even though when there's a market failure, we need markets to help solve the problem as well. But we're also going to need decentralized self-governance. So, perhaps, for example, an example is distributed generation of renewable energy. And we will also need a hierarchical types of structures, particularly when it comes to communication between local governments, provincial governments, federal governments in terms of making deployments. And so the last point on this slide with respect to adaptive governance, adaptivity to new information is really key. And I think oftentimes institutions tend to not kind of perhaps invest enough in thinking about that. But it's very important to kind of take the time to figure out when it's time to change one's approach, change the direction one is going, or the institution is going, and to increase perhaps the way information is being provided, or increase or change the way information is being provided. So that's the last point I'll make about that. And so this is my last slide. And the way I want to leave this is I think I'm going to put on, I guess, my political scientist hat to end this off. I'm going to note that, I think participatory democracy is really important in making happen what needs to happen and at a faster rate. Okay, so political action means that politicians will need to be confident that citizens are on their side if they're actually proposing the large-scale investments that we need to go ahead. And to do that, I think it's very important, and I know probably the crowd that's out here likely has done one or more of these suggestions, but it's very important to make our voices heard by politicians. And there's a number of ways we can do that. Ideally, we can try to do all of them. I certainly don't have time to do all of them, but I do my best. So some suggestions here for participatory democracy. How do we convince politicians that we are on their side and we want this to happen? Voicing your support for a robust carbon tax. That is absolutely important. Showing up at town halls, participating in local city-level policy making. Even so, shareholder activism is a good example. I think there have been a lot of wins in this direction. One example that I came across from late last year is in the UK, some of the major shareholders of Shell kind of had a shareholder resolution to push Shell to reduce its carbon footprint. Somewhat ironic because it's an oil and gas company, but shareholder activism does not only apply to fossil fuel companies. It can apply to any firms that are invested in dirtier energy technologies. And then finally, this is one, I'm putting this point here because there's a comment period happening right now for the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy, and it closes on April 2nd, I believe. So commenting on strategies that government are trying to develop on sustainable development, frequently they'll have public comment periods. And, taking part in that, just, taking the time to kind of suggest what you think should be happening to go forward, these things actually really do make a difference. We might not kind of think that because there's a separation between when we're taking the action and when something happens, but I think the more voices the politicians hear in favor of climate action, it really can't hurt. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya. That's very optimistic. Nice, great of you to point out that there are opportunities. So now I guess we'll go to the question and answer session.